Scripture reading this morning is from Genesis 16, 1 through 16. I apologize for my voice. I even thought about having Lori come up and lip sync, or so I could lip sync, but he'll have to deal with it. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, has borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai's wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar so that she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road of Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that you will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hands will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," she said. "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahai. It is still there between Kadesh and Bir. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she bore. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. This is the word of the Lord.
Boy, what a mess of a story, don't you think? I guess if there's a wee bit of good news here, it is that God continues to use people who still have some problems. We were cruising along fine last week. The Lord has called Abram. Abram had some doubts. The Lord answered him. And then this mess where not only can you imagine a marriage giving permission for adultery, but then it causes this division between the women. Can you imagine what was going on between Abram and Sarai? It's a tragic story. And you and I, of course, know how history played out through Ishmael and his descendants, and finally Abram and Sarai's son and his descendants. There is still conflict between those people groups today. What a mess. What we need to remember, though, what we need to focus on is not the mistakes that the people make, it's that God is on a mission. Even in this story, God is teaching us, and God is on a mission. So 4,000 years ago, the Lord came to Abram, and he spoke to him, and he said, "Abram, I want you to leave your father's house, your country, and your kindred, and go to the land I will show you, and I will I'll turn you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and I will bless you, and through you, all people on earth will be blessed." That's God announcing what he's going to do to Abram through him. I'm on a mission, he's saying. So 500 or so more years after that, God came to Moses. And he said to Moses, "I have heard the outcry of my people who are enslaved in Egypt, and I'm going to deliver them into their own land." That's God who's still on a mission. about 3,000 years ago. So 500 years after that, God came to his king, David. And he said, David, I'm going to bring your people into their own land, and I'm going to put one of your descendants on the throne forever and ever. That's God on a mission. Of course, we can see where this is driving with Jesus Christ because we're looking back from our perspective. But that mission didn't just stop with Abram and Moses and David. It went on through the prophets to Isaiah, who said, Here am I, Lord, send me. It went right into the New Testament era where the disciples heard the call of Jesus, who said, I want you to go and wait in Jerusalem, and when you receive power from on high, then you go and be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That is God on a mission. And Jesus said, I tell you the truth. You who believe in me will do greater things than I have done. That's God who is still on a mission. That's what we've really been leading up to in this series, the reality of experiencing God. It's the reality of experiencing God who is doing his mission through us. Not just the reality of sensing God's presence or having the cockles of our hearts warmed. It's instead, how can we experience God as the God who is on a mission and invites us to be on that mission with him. We're in the 5th week of our series here, and that's what we're learning, is that God is inviting us and that we can experience God working his mission through us. Not just small things, but God-sized things. I mean, this is God, after all, in his mission, bringing healing and salvation to his world. And when God invites us to a new truth, this is what we're going to look at this week. When God invites us to a new truth because he's working his mission through us, we always experience a crisis of belief. At least it's probably more aptly put, several crises. We experience, if we hear God speak to us and say, I'm going to do a God-sized thing through you, we're going to experience an internal crisis of belief. We're going to look at that again. We saw a little bit of that last week in chapter 15 with Abram. But something inside of us gets challenged when God says, I'm going to invite you to be a part of something that you can't even fathom is possible for you to be a part of. We're going to have to wrestle with whether or not we trust that God can do that. There's a personal crisis of belief. And then there's going to be a crisis in a tension between our old ways of thinking and doing, our old patterns, and our new ways of thinking and doing that are required if we're going to be with God in his work. There's a crisis there. And then finally, there's going to be a crisis in the end, even after we think we're going in God's direction with him, because the temptation almost always, when the pressure comes, when other people say you're crazy, is that we'll fall back and fall away, and then we'll miss the blessing of experiencing God doing what God alone can do through us. So when I say that we come to a crisis, this is our 5th step, what do I mean, a crisis of belief? Crisis is a word you may have heard it put this way. It's a dangerous opportunity. Have you heard that before? That the Chinese character that we translate crisis is made up of 2 other Chinese characters, one that we translate as dangerous and the other that is translated as opportunity. And so we're going to look today at this dynamic of the dangerous opportunity as it comes into Abram's life. And I'm going to try to give you some examples from other people in the Scriptures and maybe even from my own life and from our life together so that we can understand. This has all been fun stuff so far, you know. God's doing all the work. We've said that God is always at work. That was the first reality. Number 2, that God pursues a love relationship with us. That's the second reality. Number 3, that God invites us to participate with him in his work. That's the third reality. And the fourth that we looked at last week is that God speaks to us. But now we come to a hinge point, and if we're going to be a part of what God truly is about in this place and beyond, then we're going to come to this dangerous opportunity. And so let's look at the dynamic in play in the life of Abram. Here it is, Genesis chapter 12. He says, I'll make you into a great nation, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. A couple things to notice there. First of all, notice who's doing the action. God. So God doesn't come to Abram. He doesn't come to Moses. He doesn't come to David. He doesn't come to you and me and say, let me tell you what I want you to do. It's not where it starts. Instead, God simply makes an announcement about what he's doing. When you feel God calling you to be a part of something, that's not you getting to decide whether or not God's work is going to get done. God says, I will do this. This is what I'm doing, and I'm inviting you to be a part of it. I'm inviting you to be a part of my mission, not just to go on your own mission. And the second thing is, when God speaks to us and invites us into his work, it is going to be something God-sized. No, he says, I'll make you into a little nation. He didn't even say, I'm going to give you kids. He said, I'm going to make you, Abram, into a great nation. That's a part of the mission that I'm on. And through you, all nations on earth will be blessed. You see the grandeur of that, how large that is? That's the nature of God speaking to us if we're hearing correctly. It's the same with Moses, the same with David. Before them, it was the same with Jacob and with Joseph, who rose to that place of prominence in Egypt. And after them, it was the same with Isaiah in the New Testament, with the Apostle Paul and the other disciples. God speaking always then leads us to a crisis of belief. Why? Because it's going to be God-sized. And he's telling us what's going to happen. Now, we saw this last week. If you weren't here, we'll just review it real quickly in the life of Abram, chapter 15, the one before the chapter that was read for us this morning. God says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And Abram at some point says, you've given me no children. So a servant in my household will be my heir. We see, in other words, that Abram looks around him, the circumstances of his life, and he begins to have doubt. This is the beginning of his crisis of belief. God says to him, if you walk with me, I'm going to give you the land of the Chaldeans. And Abram says, but sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'll gain possession of it? He's got doubts about himself. I don't even know if I'll keep walking with the Lord faithfully enough. This is his crisis of belief. See, Abram, like you and me, we believe in God, don't we? I don't think most of us would be here. And I'm sure there are some here who don't believe in God, and you're here for other reasons, for the fellowship. You like the good things the church does. Your husband says you ought to come, or your mom, or something else. But most of us, we believe in God. We believe God can do things. But can he do it through us? What seems, when we get a picture of what we're called to do, impossible or at least implausible, something that's truly God-sized. See, this is the pattern that we see over and over and over in the New Testament, in the Bible. Let me give you one from the New Testament. We all know the Apostle Paul, right? We know that name. He wrote about a third of the New Testament. Most of the letters there were written by the Apostle Paul. Well, Paul, of course, his story is that he was a zealot for God, but against the church. His name was Saul at that point, and he was rising through the ranks of the religious establishment as he sought out Christians to throw them into prison, to kill them. He was actually the one, when they wanted to stone Stephen, the deacon, they needed approval from somebody, and there was Paul who had approval to do such things. And so they came and laid Stephen's clothes at Saul's feet. And yet, as you and I know, Jesus, the risen Lord, met him on the road to Damascus. He was struck blind. He heard a voice, and he said to him then, the voice said to Saul, why are you persecuting, not my church, why are you persecuting me? And it was a life-changing situation for Saul, who eventually, his name, of course, became Paul. What did he do? What was the first thing that he did after that happened? Does anybody remember? You might be surprised. Let me read it for you. This is Galatians chapter 1. Paul writes in this letter to the church in Galatia, you've heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, listen, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later I returned to Damascus. His first response, see, when we hear something God-sized, we start saying to somebody, you think this can be true? You know, certainly God didn't mean for us to do it that way. Maybe he meant for us to do it this way. You know, maybe it's not to feed 5,000, maybe we can feed 500. We start to bargain. But Paul didn't do that, and he didn't go out and start doing what he felt God had called him to do. Instead, he retreated to a place where the internal conflict, the crisis of belief that he no doubt had. Here's a man who devoted his life to God, and he just had found out that everything he'd done was diametrically opposed to the plan of God. You think that wouldn't shake you to the core? He's got a crisis. And so he retreats for 3 years to spend time with the Lord in prayer, to let the Lord resolve the crisis. Let the Lord teach him who he is. Let the Lord equip him for this great task. See, God is making him into something new. A change has to take place within him before he can participate in God's work. Let me give you another example that's even closer. You might remember this one. So there was a church that had been in existence for well over 100 years, about 150 years, and suddenly 22 acres around the church, which only had about 6 acres, came available for purchase. 22 acres. The church at the time, though, had $2.2 million worth of debt from other things that they believed God had called them to do. And yet, the leaders of the church felt like God was saying, purchase this property that ministry might take place on it throughout the generations. And that church signed to purchase the property, $3.2 million. And many people said, that's idiocy. We already owe over $2 million from past commitments we made. We can never raise this kind of money. And they're right, we can't. But with God, what happened? Remember, that was just 2007. And we look at it now like, of course we did that. That was easy, you know. $5 million. We're down. We have about $800,000 worth of debt at this point. Isn't that amazing? And we've got some folks who say, we'd like to take care of that too. You know, God willing, we'd like to take care of that too. How does this happen? Well, it happened because when the leaders heard this call, we spent 6 months preparing to share the opportunity with everybody. We spent months in prayer. We went inside and said, boy, if we're going to do this, something has to change with us. In fact, some of you may recall, I bet many won't, but some of you may recall that what we said to you when we announced the 6 weeks of our campaign, let's see what God can do in 6 weeks, we said to you husbands and wives, you families, we said, don't go home and discuss this. What? No, don't go home and get out your bank book and say, how much do you think we can put aside in the next 3 years to participate in this? We said, don't do that. Instead, go home and pray. Pray together, but also pray privately, and don't talk numbers. Just pray and say, God, you reveal what you want us to do. Why? Because we know that when God invites us to be a part of something God-sized, the first crisis is in our own hearts. And so many of us found, initially we thought, I got a number. I can give an extra whatever, $10 a week or $100 a week or whatever. And as God worked in us, God said, you want to do something God-sized? Watch what I can do through you. Very first time that Lori and I had that same kind of opportunity, it was in another church. We prayed for 6 weeks independently how much we should give. This incidentally was the year that the boys were born. So we went from one daughter to now twin boys. Lori, who can make money because she's an attorney, not able to work as many hours. And so we prayed for 6 weeks independently, and finally I said, okay, it's time. Do you have a number? She said, I've had it for 5 weeks. She's a little bit easier on the uptake, I think, with God than I am. And I said, okay, well, I got a number too, $25,000. I made about $50,000 at the time, $55,000 at the time, $25,000. She said, that's the number the Lord gave me. She said, you better sign a piece of paper or something because we're going to chicken out if we don't tell somebody we're going to do this. We did it, and you know what? 5 weeks later, Lori called me up and said, honey, you sitting down? I just got a check in the mail from a business that my brother and I started a couple years ago, and we're going to tithe on the profits. And so we have a check for $23,500 coming. See, we never would have experienced God doing through us what only God could do if we hadn't have gone through the crisis of faith, if we just said, well, we can afford an extra $5 a week or something. Every time, always when God invites us into His work, there's going to be some work that has to be done with us. There's going to be an internal crisis before we do anything concrete. And this is where Adam, incidentally, in our rather tragic story today, misstepped. See, our crisis of faith reveals what we really believe about God. What we do next reveals it. If we're just going to go out and say, I can handle this, I'll do it my way, or if we say, Lord, you're going to have to do a work in me because I can't see how it can be done. That's the crisis of belief. And how we respond in crisis defines us at that time in our lives. So last week in chapter 15, God answered Abram's fears and his doubts, right? Doubts about God and doubts about himself. Abram's in his crisis of belief, but he's not willing to stay there. What's he do next? Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar, gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. This is why I call this time that we're in right now a dangerous opportunity. Oh, there's opportunity, all right. We are on the cusp of being able to experience God and experience Him as a living God doing God-like things through and in us. The danger is we can decide to take matters into our own hands, to do things in our own strength, just as Abram did, to forget that it's actually God's mission that we're invited to participate in, and so it's a God-sized task. And if that's the truth, then God's going to have to equip us. He's going to have to empower it. He's going to have to make it happen. Otherwise, you're not going to experience God. Scriptures teach this over and over and over again, that the work that we get to be a part of is all because God equips us. Here's Philippians chapter 2. It is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. It's all God. Or 2 Timothy 2:21, those who cleanse themselves will be instruments for special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work. It's God who has to do the work in us. And so our first task is to seek God in prayer, to let God begin the change in us that is necessary for us to experience Him at work through us. Don't you wish we had an opportunity to do that right now? I mean, to put this to the test right now? Guess what? We have leaders in our church who have been working and praying now for years since the purchase of the property on how we continue to do more for Jesus. What would God have us do that would be kingdom growth, not just maintenance? And those discussions are ongoing. They're not quite ready for prime time. I think in the months ahead, I'm going to be able to stand before you and say, okay, brace yourself for a crisis of belief, because this is what our leaders are discerning that God is doing. We see some pieces of it, but we're trying to figure out a little bit more. We want to make sure we're hearing from the Lord on this. I can tell you one small piece of it that surprised all of us, and it's going to start in January. You know that we've had a group of people who've come to be a part of us now worshiping on Saturday nights through contemporary worship, and we have a small group that's continued to worship through contemporary worship on Sunday night, but we also know that that's not prime time. How many of you want to go to church on Saturday night or Sunday night? No, this is when we go to church. And so our leadership has decided that we need to have a service on Sunday morning that isn't just the style that you and I know and are comfortable with, but that might speak to other generations or to people who aren't as churched. And so starting in January, we're going to add another service on Sunday mornings, and we're going to have a contemporary worship service on Sunday mornings at Central College. How do you do that? We already have services at 8 o'clock, 9:30, and 11. And so at 4 a.m. on Sundays, we're going to be... Wouldn't work, would it? And yet we've been praying about this and praying about it. In fact, this church has been praying about this and find ways to do this for how many years, David? 20 years, I think, maybe was the first, or 15 years ago, long before I came. So we're going to do it at the same time we do this service right now. We're going to have 2 services on Sunday morning at the same time. We'll do our traditional service here, and then we're going to work on Kirk Hall so we can have a contemporary service there, and all those kids from families here and there will be able to have the same education hour. We're going to do that in January. And I know we're going to have some people who think you're crazy. I can't find parking anymore, you know? But we're going to do it. Because after going inside and letting God change us, we've said we're going to do what it takes, Lord. We're ready. Leadership is figuring out a way that we can make this happen and be a part of this together. But hey, there's lots more to come. And in the coming months, I'm sure I'll be able to share more, but I'm warning you up front, it's going to be God-sized. It's going to be big. How do we not just continue to maintain, but how do we say, oh, we heard you, God, when you said make disciples. We heard you when you said that we're going to be your witnesses, not just at home, but in the region around us and to the ends of the earth. We are going to do more. We're going to feed more people. We're going to teach more children. We're going to have more worship. And when we announce it, you know, it's going to be a crisis in your heart as it is in mine. And the first step when that comes is not to talk to your neighbors and say, don't you think these guys are crazy? Or here, why don't you take my handmaiden and have a baby with her? No, it's going to be to pray, to seek God. We're in that step right now. Now, the second step, and we're going to talk about this a lot more next week, is that then some things have to change. See, once we wrestle internally, we have this crisis of belief. If we want to say, okay, God, I'm going to go with you, then some of our patterns are going to have to change. Some of our habits are going to have to change. There's always a tension between what was and has been and what God is doing and what will be. There's always that tension there. But more about that next. So what I want to do before we come to the Lord's table here in 2 minutes is I just want to review where we are as we are on this exciting journey together. So number one, it's all God's work. So God, number one, is always at work, right? Number two, pursues a love relationship with us. Number three, invites us to participate with him. And number four, speaks to us. How can he invite us without speaking to us? But then we are faced with a crisis of belief. That's what we talked about today. And we're going to have to make some adjustments if we're going to be a part of God's great work. And then finally, only when we obey, make those adjustments, will we get to do as we did in 2007 and 2008, experience God do what only God could do. That's what the invitation is. You know, Paul, after his internal time with God is 3 years, after his crisis of belief, he went to Jerusalem where the other disciples were. See, at some point, you got to go public. You got to go to the people of God and say, this is what God is calling, and I'm going to be a part of his work. He took Timothy with him. Timothy, who wasn't a Jew, he was a Gentile. And Paul went to these Jewish apostles who were Christ followers, and he said, okay, here's what the mission of God is. I've been working this out in my own heart for 3 years. God is going to invite non-Jews into the true religion. And he's going to do it not by them becoming Jews, not by getting circumcised, not by them following the law, but by faith. In fact, what he's teaching us is that none of us are in God's family except by faith. And what happened when Paul did that? It put them in their own internal crisis of belief. You can read about it in the book of Acts. Chapter 17, I think it is. Could be wrong on that. But it's the book of Acts where he goes to Jerusalem. And they wrestled together and they thought and they said, what is God doing? And then finally they said, guys, if God is in this, we better get on board. He better change our hearts so that we can participate in this great work. And that's what happens. When we sense that God is calling us to do something, we have our own crisis, then when we go out and we face the tension of what we've always done versus what's going to be, we're going to see two types of people. And guess what? God's spiritual people are going to come along. They'll wrestle with it, but they'll come alongside you as you seek to be on mission with God. And some others who maybe believe in God but aren't willing to do that internal work, they'll be the ones who say, not possible. I don't want to change. We'll see both kinds. Our response to that crisis of belief will tell us something about who we are. Many of those too, I think then, as they see others, saying, yeah, God can do this, will get on board too. That's the way it often happens. So again, I'm going to give you details on this as I'm able. It's just not time yet, but we're going to have to see if we're ready to commit our time at Central College and our wallets, doubtless, boldly for kingdom growth, or whether we'll fall timidly behind, whether or not we will obey and experience God at work, or hold back and simply believe. But when we do, when we let that crisis come over us, and we do the hard work in here to say, I trust you even when I can't see it with my eyes, then God will equip us for that good work. And so let me close this message as we come to the Lord's table with a benediction. This too comes from Scripture. This is Hebrews chapter 13, verses 20 through 21. So now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, may he equip you now with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.